Thanks for having me here. I'm going to feel like a bit of an anomaly today. You've heard two presentations that offer solutions and an insight into a particular aspect of Canadian history, along with some wonderful slides. I'm going to actually share with you a conundrum or a problem that we've been working on. And at some point, you're going to see that my slides don't correspond with what I'm saying. Don't panic. I panicked because I'm trying to give you a sense of the defamiliarization and the difficulty we've been having. Fiona Lucas and I have been working on a critical edition of the Female Emigrants Guide, and we're trying to come up with a general introduction for it. So we came up with a scholarly introduction, and the publisher said, no. What we want is a general audience introduction that explains why an 1855 cookbook is relevant in the contemporary moment. We want to modernize the recipes. We want to hear what this book is really about for a contemporary audience, which makes sense, right? The problem was, when I went to look at the contemporary cookbooks, or cookbooks that were contemporary with this book, especially the handwritten manuscripts, it was like night and day. They were giving us recipes that were completely different. The tone was different, the level of anxiety was different, and I couldn't understand quite why this book had become such an important book, and yet why it was being dismissed by the critics of the day. Now, you're historians in the room, you all know the flaws with this book, but what I'm going to try and do is reclaim it along with another book and offer up some of the insights that I'm starting to come up with as to why this book is of value. Parr, Traill, and Adelaide Hoodless received pretty harsh treatment by the jury of public opinion, both in their own day and in the decades and century that followed. So why revisit their legacy today when exploring historical perspectives on food and health? Well, this morning I'm going to try and offer up two possible answers to this question, but I'm going to ask you to offer up some more answers or precisions as they come to mind. First answer, both women profoundly influenced Canadian home foodways. I began to look at these two women to explore the ways in which they actually influenced the Canadian home cook. Although Traill's work is known to literary scholars and to botanists, the value of what is emerging as her watershed contribution, the Female Emigrants Guide, which was published in serial form in 1854, and again in book form in 1855, is essentially given short shrift. Tellingly, literary scholar Michael Peterman gives it only a very scanty paragraph, I think it's 2 sentences, in his rather lengthy description of Parr Traill, certainly since the book does fall short of the literary value of that of her sister, Susanna Moodie. Right? But then again, it was never intended to be a literary masterpiece. Rather, it's arguably the first cookbook written by a Canadian and about food practices and the practical realities of the New World, and that's what distinguishes it from the first cookbook, which was called The Cook Not Mad in 1840, and presented by a singular voice, which is what distinguishes it from La Cuisinière Canadienne in 1840 and La Nouvelle Cuisinière Canadienne in 1850. Further, because it was distributed to new emigrants as they landed in the new country, Female Emigrants Guide has gained remarkable currency. It deserves more attention as a valuable source of information about perspectives of food and health in 1854. Now, as you know, Adelaide Hoodless influenced foodways not really through her publications, but through her significant activism. She was a strident voice in support of manual training and school curriculum, which for girls meant domestic science and home economics. Her primary legacy in terms of influencing foodways, then, lies in institutionalizing the training of domestic science or home economics. Teachers. She was herself untrained, either in science or in the field that emerged from her advocacy. Therefore, it's not surprising that the textbook she authored in 1898, gosh, you can't see it, The Public School Domestic Science, was disappointing as a textbook and came under considerable scrutiny. While it is disappointing as a textbook, derivative and full of generalizations, for my purpose here, it's terrific, precisely because it's derivative. It offers insights into the thinking of the period in which household economics and domestic science were crystallizing as a disciplinary field in Canada. In his biographical entry on Hoodless, Terry Crowley describes it as, quote, a compilation of recent scientific findings derived from the application of chemistry to the understanding of food values, preservation, and preparation, unquote. The book, published in 1898. Now, mind you, there were better respected cookbooks, textbooks published in Canada in the decades that followed. The Canadian Cookbook in 1923, for example, Manuel de Cuisine Raisonnée in 1919. However, Hoodless's textbook deserves closer scrutiny as a valuable source of information about perspectives on food and health in 1898 Canada. Okay, so far so good. And I don't think I've come up with anything new here. But the second answer is where we come up with something interesting, right? They and their representative publications bookend a period during which germ theory transformed notions of the responsibilities of the household's primary food producer and caregiver, aka mother. The most telling distinction between the two guides, admittedly ones that were written for completely different audiences, lies in terminology. Both women underscore the importance of cleanliness. With Traill, however, cleanliness is as much a function of propriety as of health. Emigrants should, quote, have both their clothes and their persons quite clean before embarking, unquote, she explains. When making dough, quote, rub the damp flour in your hands, which must, of course, be delicately clean, unquote. She means your hands, not the dough. Right. For Traill, the propriety of cleanliness extends beyond humankind. Of black squirrels, she writes, quote, nothing can be more cleanly than the habits of these little creatures, their food consisting entirely of grains or fruit or vegetables, unquote. After all, Traill is trying to convince the new emigrants, specifically of that dainty class, and I'm using the term carefully here, to avail themselves of available food supplies in the new world. The bear, she explains, is certainly more cleanly feeder than the hog, right? In Traill's work, there's a basic sense of kitchen hygiene and order, hygiene being a term in currency as of about 1811 to mean the relationship of diet to health. Meat is packed with clean salt. The edges of pots used to boil maple sap should be rubbed with clean lard to prevent the sap boiling over. She advises to pare apples in clean water, spread them on clean boards, and dry and store them in clean wooden or stone vessels. The word comes up again and again. Most tellingly, however, in comparison with Hoodless, when she's referring to dairy products, Traill has an intuitive and a practical sense of the importance of cleanliness. Quote, the thorough extracting of the milky particles and the working of the salt well through the mass of butter cannot be too much insisted on. Attention to cleanliness, coolness in summer, and moderate temperature in winter are the most important matters for securing good, marketable butter. However, cleanliness for milk seems largely to be a function of appearance and smell for Traill, and Traill dwells very little on the care and the properties beyond mentioning the advantage of a cellar for those who would enjoy sweet, wholesome milk. That said, milk is an essential ingredient for desserts and baking and key to preparation methods. The contrast between this common sense approach by Traill for the Settler household and the fastidious insistence upon cleanliness as a primary consideration for the domestic scientist, both teacher and pupil, is striking and particularly apparent in Hoodless's careful attention to working with milk, and most of you know the reason for this. Quote, personal cleanliness must be insisted upon, unquote, explains Hoodless very early on in her 1898 textbook. Milk absorbs germs from the air and from unclean vessels very readily. Milk should be thoroughly sterilized and germ-free and must be heated to the boiling point of 212 degrees Fahrenheit, she writes. This may be done by putting the milk into perfectly clean bottles and placing in a rack in a kettle of boiling water, remaining until it reaches the necessary degree of heat. The bottle should be closely covered immediately after with absorbent cotton or cotton batting in order to prevent it getting into the milk. I'm actually giving you that lengthy quote just to show the level of detail. She's absolutely fastidious in making sure that you're careful with the milk. Elsewhere, I've got Catherine here. Elsewhere, Hoodless actually documents the push to milk pasteurization. You're the Catherine here. Elsewhere, Catherine actually documents the push to milk pasteurization, and Hoodless would definitely be in the affirmative camp. I've got confused with the Catherines here. More generally in the textbook, Hoodless's prescriptions incorporate the new language of germ theory. Quote, borax is an effective cleanser, disinfectant, and bleacher, emphasis mine. Dishcloths and dish towels must be kept clean as a matter of health. The greasy dishcloth furnishes a favorable field for the growth of germs, right? In turn, food preparation methods seem designed with health and hygiene in mind, rather than the pleasure of the palate. And this is my last quote from Hoodless. The chemical changes produced by cooking food properly aid digestion, besides destroying germs which may be contained in the food. Nearly all foods, except fruit, require cooking. The object in cooking meat is to soften and loosen the tissue, which renders it more easily digested. Another object is to sterilize or kill any germs which may exist, and to make it more palatable. Nigella Lawson, Hoodless, is not, right? What has brought such a profound change in perspective and terminology in the half-century between both publications? Well, historians in the room will be familiar with the answer here. It's a late 19th century story, the revolution of germ theory. But as handwritten cookbooks attest, and I offer a few examples from the Guelph archives in the next few slides, the insistence on cleanliness in both of these books must be understood in relation to mother's responsibility for household health in the New World, which was nothing short of daunting. A German, Robert Koch, discovered in 1876 the minute living thing called a germ that caused anthrax, usually a cattle disease, and then he turned his attention to the other diseases of his day. In 1882, he announced discovery of the germ causing TB, which was actually a hugely distressful piece of news to those caring for ill relatives, obviously. 2 years later, Koch announced the discovery of the causal agent of cholera. But it would only be in the mid-20th century, with something known as the therapeutic revolution, that we actually started to understand the ways to cure some of these diseases, largely with the widespread sale of penicillin. Right? Germ theory did not emerge without its skeptics, among them promoters of spontaneous generation. It was in proving evidence to refute this challenge that Frenchman Louis Pasteur contributed to the growing acceptance of germ theory that powerfully influenced personal habits and household food practices in the years immediately following the breakthrough discoveries. For my comparison between Traill and Hoodless, however, the key question is not so much what knowledge emerged in the intervening years as what aspects of that emergent knowledge reached Hoodless. Clearly, the word germ did reach her. After the death of her son from tainted milk in 1889, 7 years after Koch's breakthrough discovery of the anthrax-causing germ, one can only imagine her urgent and bittersweet curiosity about emergent scientific knowledge. She was not trained as a scientist, but she clearly did read around the subject. In the list of suggested readings she provided in her textbook, we can see some of the sources that she herself must have consulted. She mentions 3. First, the publications of the U.S. experiment stations led by Professor Atwater and other eminent chemists of the time. By this, she refers to Wilbur Olin Atwater, whose experiment stations were actually funded by the U.S. government as of 1887 and produced annual reports. They're absolutely fascinating. The second source she cites was The Chemistry of Cooking and Cleaning by Ellen H. Richards and Miss Talbot. As you probably know, Ellen Richards and Marion Talbot were both academics and pioneers in the fields of women's education, and were instrumental in the Lake Placid conferences that gave rise to the Household Economics Association in the U.S. The third and last book that she mentions is the Boston Cookbook, familiar to most of you, except it was the other edition. It was the one by Mrs. Lincoln in 1884. More familiar to us is Fanny Farmer's 1896 Boston Cookbook. And this is interesting because even in its 1918 edition, it does not mention the word germ specifically. It does, however, mention the notion of vitamins and describes them as growth-producing substances which were important, especially for children, to be found in milk, butter, egg yolks, green leaves, etc. It's really not so far off the truth that we believe today. In making such a statement, Farmer is remarkably up to date. Only in 1898 did Frederick Hopkins postulate that accessory factors were necessary for human body function, 2 years after the Fanny Farmer's book was first published. Right? And it would only be in 1929 that he and Christian Ehrlichman won the Nobel Prize for discoveries of vitamins. Right? Hoodless and her textbook on domestic science lie at the cusp of a changing world. As Terry Crowley has pointed out, Hoodless increasingly felt sidelined during her own lifetime by the domestic science students and teachers whose own professional status her advocacy had enabled. But I think there's another perspective that is consistently overlooked. I came to the Guelph archives a few weeks ago to explore the Hoodless papers, hoping to find some notes of the reading she had done in relation to emergent scientific knowledge. Nothing, right? Incredibly disappointing in terms of trying to find that information. What I did find, however, was essentially the raw material that had been so well mined already by Hoodless biographer Cheryl MacDonald and historians such as Terry Crowley, with one exception. There was one stone, a gem in the rough, that has been left unturned. Hoodless's significant respect for philanthropists, notably the Empress Friedrich in Germany, the Princess of Wales in Britain, and perhaps more importantly, the wife of German gun manufacturer Frau Krupp, and particularly the astute American philanthropist Mary Porter Tillotson Hemingway, who died in 1894. All of these women dedicated their energies to funding and facilitating the institutionalization of manual training for girls and boys, rather than becoming directly involved in the education itself. Hoodless was well established as a wife of a furniture manufacturer, but she was far from the stature of these eminent and financial stability of these eminent financial women and philanthropists whom she sought to emulate. What she lacked in fortune, however, she attempted to make up in fortitude, sometimes at her peril, because she did have 2 nervous breakdowns, as Crowley documents. Hoodless's detractors have focused both on her inability to gain respect in the field for which she advocated and in her class bias, since the institutions and initiatives she supported tend to focus on the working girl. Specifically, the Ontario Normal School of Domestic Science was challenged for its elitism. But her detractors failed to judge Hoodless according to her own standards and ambitions as a philanthropist who was, at times, very short of money. And they neglect to acknowledge the remarkable speed at which this amateur domestic scientist managed to incorporate the emergent knowledge of her day into her communications. Now, as for Traill, there was much for common sense approach to disease prevention. In Female Emigrant's Guide, one finds no cough remedies at all, while they are the mainstay of the handwritten recipes of the time. I could have put 96 of them up here. Right? Many years ago, she writes, making the one mention to a cough in her cookbook, it was a rare thing to hear of colds, coughs, or influenzas. Now it's very common, and I believe with many medical men, that the stoves have to answer for these disorders. People heat their room like ovens and go out into the sharp, frosty air. They return again from the keen, frosty air into heated rooms. Their tender organs of respirations are not fitted to stand such reverses, and pulmonary disease and colds in the head are the result, which not unfrequently end in consumption. She really wasn't far off, and Koch would find evidence some years later to prove her point. And it was clear that curing TB was not actually, it was not a solution to put people in a hot room where they actually shared the same air. Thank you.